Warning: there are many different situations that call for many different solutions. Please take your time and listen to this video as many times as it takes to understand. Please do your own research and come to your own conclusion before making any large decision.
Want to be a drug addict? If you live in the US, chances are you probably already are. The US, land of the free, of MTV, and of legal drugs. This might just be what makes America great. A place where our doctors prescribe us pills that we don't need for conditions that don't exist. It's a win-win. Big Pharma gets bigger and richer, and we get higher or just die. The story was different 50 years ago when John went down to his dentist's office to get his wisdom teeth pulled, and the doctor gave him aspirin as pain medication. This was a time when young men went to war and women worked off at home to save the country from collapse. Now, we get high, play video games, watch YouTube, and complain when somebody doesn't call us the right gender. And these days, if old Johnny Boy goes down to the dentist and gets some work done, it's dealer's choice. Vicodin, Percocet, codeine, you name it. Whatever company happens to be in bed with your doctor that day. And if you don't have private insurance that pays for your drugs, no problem. Sign up for Medicaid, and you'll definitely be able to get free drugs through them. Hello everyone, Thought Monkey here. Today we're going to explore the issue of what Big Pharma doesn't want anybody to know. First, what exactly is the pharmaceutical industry? To make a long story short, it's a business that creates drugs for use as medications. It's important to note that it's not a terrible industry. In fact, they have made some very important discoveries like insulin, which has saved millions of lives, or the countless vaccines that have protected us from at one point very common diseases like measles and hepatitis. The problem is not the idea of pharmaceuticals. Drugs are neither good nor bad. They can either be helpful or dangerous depending upon their use. The problem with Big Pharma is that it is literally killing people, and it's making a profit doing so. And our government is basically encouraging it. You may ask yourself how an industry that's supposed to be providing us medication which is regulated by the Federal Drug Administration, an organization responsible for protecting the public health by assuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human drugs, is killing us. Let's first look at the health statistics. 99% of hydrocodone worldwide use is in the US. We know this drug more colloquially as Vicodin, which is just a company that makes hydrocodone. This is a drug that the FDA rates as less dangerous as marijuana, but in 2011 caused nearly 100,000 emergency department visits. The US makes up 5% of the world's population, but consumes 80% of its opioid consumption. On average, 40 deaths per day are linked specifically to prescription opioids and over 100,000 deaths per year linked with prescription drugs in general. This is far more deaths than what illegal street drugs cause. Prescription drugs are now the fourth leading cause of death in the US. Okay, you get the point. Prescription drugs are dangerous and they are killing people. But now the question is, why are people taking them if they're so dangerous? The answer lies in the incredible reach of Big Pharma. The pharmaceutical industry spends between $30 and $60 billion a year on advertising their miracle drugs. You've all seen their ads. Blue skies, beautiful couple, trees, having trouble sleeping, bad knees, buy our pill and feel like new. And then the 10-second list of possible side effects, which always include, and in extreme cases, death. The folks that regulate these advertisements have a budget of only $9 million. Do you really think a $9 million budget is enough to regulate something that is more than 6,000 times that size? This is not a David vs. Goliath story. This is the ant versus the elephant. Big Pharma is also notorious for selling drugs that aren't approved for certain symptoms, a practice called off-label promotion. For example, your doctor might prescribe you an antidepressant because she or he believes it will help your migraines. This practice is at times legal and at other times illegal. If illegal, you will learn shortly, however, that the fine is usually smaller than the profit these companies make. Big Pharma might just consider it another tax of doing business, and yes, it has in some cases caused death. There is also the idea that Big Pharma creates new illnesses and solves them with their pills. Sounds like a conspiracy theory, right? But actually it makes a lot of sense, and you've probably seen an ad that talks about some made-up illness and a pill to fix it without thinking twice. For example, restless leg syndrome. Is that really an illness? When I sit down for long periods of time, my leg moves, but I think it's because I'm bored and I don't want to be sitting. which by the way is an extremely unnatural position for our bodies to be in. I mean, where in nature can you find anything like the modern chair, and when in history did we ever have to sit down for 8 hours a day? Yeah, our legs are restless simply because we're not supposed to be sitting down for 8 hours a day doing the work that we are in the modern age. But yeah, if you want a pill for that imaginary illness, guess what? It exists. Go on WebMD. There are dozens of recommended drugs you can take for your lively leg. So it's easy to see that these drugs kill people, and it's pretty easy to understand why people buy them. I mean, the consumer here is f***ed. We're relying on a budget the size of an ant to regulate the behavior of an elephant, and it gets worse because the ant, or in this case our government, ends up helping the elephant, or Big Pharma. The government-sponsored health programs Medicaid and Medicare, part of the ant in our example, actually perpetuate this problem. Both of these are government health programs funded by our taxes that provide health care to people who either can't afford it on their own or are old. Healthcare, however, unfortunately often just means providing pills for people who have problems. In this respect, our taxes are literally killing us. You can actually think of it like a cycle, and I'll explain that in a minute. First, how is our government f***ing us so badly? Big Pharma donates millions and millions of dollars to our Congress members and even presidents. Yes, even Obama was given a whopping $1.2 million in his 2008 election by Big Pharma. You know when a friend lends you money, you feel obliged to pay them back, whether it's in dollars or favors? In Washington. The favors here, though, come in enormous tax breaks, tiny fines for violating laws such as the prohibition of off-label promotion, and, of course, the revolving door between the FDA and Big Pharma. One current example of a tax break is under the Republican Trump Care Plan, where Big Pharma would get $28 billion in breaks. The company Johnson & Johnson alone would reap in $19.8 billion. The biggest ever Big Pharma fine for illegal activity, on the other hand, was $2.3 billion when the company Pfizer, the Viagra company, was found mismarketing a handful of their drugs. That same year, the company made $43 billion in gross profit despite such a fine. That same year, the company was found guilty in causing the deaths of at least 5 Nigerian guinea pig children in a trial run of one of their drugs. Wow, and let's just say the more research I did, the worse it got. And what about those revolving doors? According to one study in some scientific magazine that only 10 people probably read, it says that between 2001 and 2010, half of all blood researchers in the FDA that reviewed drugs between those years moved on to work for Big Pharma. This makes sense though. The FDA doesn't offer the salary that the billion-dollar pharma industry does. And frustrated yet dedicated FDA members have also talked about the fact that they can't stop certain drugs from being approved because their bosses are being pressured by Big Pharma lobbyists. In essence, the thing that is supposed to regulate Big Pharma is being regulated by Big Pharma. So here's the cycle. Big Pharma wants to make money on their new drug. They have to convince doctors to prescribe it, and they do so in many different ways. One way is by using beautiful saleswomen or men because they recruit from modeling agencies. But let's move on. The doctor then has a patient with such and such problem, headache, restless leg syndrome, whatever it is. Let's use depression as an example. The doctor then prescribes the pill that the pharma rep just pitched. The patient's insurance or Medicaid or Medi-Cal, paid for by our taxes, or the patient alone, then pays for the prescription that he or she may or may not actually need. The patient doesn't know, however, that they just got a pill that includes one drug for depression and another to sedate the person from intense agitation. It then causes that person to go on a rampage, and I'm not kidding, this actually happened. Look up Joseph Westbecker. The pill, Prozac. Big Pharma makes billions because of their strategic Prozac marketing campaign, but gets a slap on the wrist for their negligent business dealings. Joseph and 6 others died due to his rampage, not to mention however many other rampage killings are due to Prozac side effects. But Big Pharma makes billions and gets to spread the love to the FDA, Congress, and even the president. They all high-five and make a of money. This, though, is just the tip of the iceberg. And well, I thought you should know. The moral of the story, don't do drugs, guys. All it does is f*** you up and make rich people richer.
Even severe mental distress can affect most anyone. But does this mean we are all insane? What causes psychological distress? Early psychiatrists thought it was an imbalance of the humors that could only be cured by bleeding patients with knives or leeches. Other psychiatrists believed mental problems came from organs like the tonsils, the stomach, and the spleen, and cut them out. Later were attempts to alter brain function, but these efforts also failed. Today, psychiatrists tell us that the way to fix unwanted behavior is by balancing brain chemistry with a pill. Did they get it right this time?
They say you have a chemical imbalance of serotonin and dopamine, but there's never been a study to ever prove that, ever. It's just been indoctrinated into the culture and television advertising to the point where people now believe it as fact.
Despite this lack of evidence, psychiatrists will tell you that psychotropic drugs are just like mainstream medical drugs. Can this be true? The answer is that unlike a drug such as insulin that corrects a measurable and proven imbalance in the body, psychotropic medications have no visible or measurable physical abnormality to correct. Here is evidence of a bacterial infection. Here is the psychiatric disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Here is a broken arm. Here is major depressive disorder. This is a brain tumor. And this is bipolar disorder. Which raises the question, how can you medicate something that is not physically there? The answer is, you can't. And furthermore, because psychotropic drugs are specifically designed to get past the body's natural defenses and into the brain, they can upset the very delicate processes the brain needs to ensure the body runs smoothly.
Every time you throw something into the system that's foreign to the system, you're creating imbalances elsewhere within the system.
The body changes as a result of taking the medication, so when you stop taking the medication, the body's got to change back to the way it was before, if it can, because it can't always. And in doing so, it disrupts the whole system.
This is what creates the sometimes serious side effects.
Paxil was the drug that gave me insomnia. I would cry very easily on it, and I completely lost my appetite within the first 2 days of taking it.
It didn't help me study, it didn't help me do anything. I didn't even want to do work because I was so sick.
Psych meds didn't help me at all. They made matters, I'd say probably like 10 times worse for me, maybe even 20.
Only now I was further impaired by the medications, and I started having car accidents.
They put me on Zoloft, and it made me want to kill myself.
And I realized that those drugs were just destroying me. Even when I was on them, I realized that they were destroying me.
In spite of the crippling effects of their drugs, psychiatrists and drug companies have used them to create a huge and lucrative market worth billions. And they've done this by naming more and more of life's problems as medical disorders, requiring psychiatric treatment. For example, shyness becomes social anxiety disorder. Loss of a loved one, major depressive disorder. Homesickness, separation anxiety. Suspicion, paranoid personality disorder. Having ups and downs, bipolar disorder. Distractibility, ADHD. This is why it is almost impossible for anyone to see a psychiatrist today and not be diagnosed with a mental illness. And a diagnosis of mental illness means psychotropic drugs.
When a patient goes into a psychiatrist's office and asks for help, probably 98, 99, maybe even 99.9% of people are going to receive a medication.
And these medications have been estimated to cause over 700,000 serious adverse reactions a year and 42,000 deaths. Meanwhile, the psychiatric industry rakes in $1/3 of $1 trillion a year. The issue isn't whether or not people's emotional problems are real. They are. What we really should be asking is, how did psychiatrists convince people that these problems were signs of mental illness? How did they use these illnesses to create a demand by doctors and the public for psychotropic drugs? And how did these drugs, with no known curative powers and a long list of side effects, become the standard treatment for every problem in life? It took months for Robin to wean herself off just one of her psychiatric drugs. And addiction specialists agree that slowly withdrawing is the only safe way.
You just can't cut people off from these drugs. Sometimes it can take up to a year or more, depending on the person and how long they've been on the drug and how we wean them off.
You can't stop these drugs cold turkey. No. I would never advise anybody to just stop them. They need to be under the care of a medical practitioner.
When some of my patients come in and they talk to me about getting off of psychiatric medications, I really caution them not to just stop their drugs cold turkey, because that can really send them into a tailspin.
The data is right there. It's going to cause the symptoms that it causes. It's going to have withdrawal effects, and they know it. There's not a psychiatrist that doesn't know it.
And yet psychiatrists tell us that psychotropic drugs are the only way to keep people from insanity and alleviate mental distress. But is this really the case? Or are there other choices, effective, inexpensive, and drug-free, that could accomplish all the empty promises left broken and unfulfilled by psychiatry? After all that we have seen, should we believe psychiatrists when they claim that just around the corner is their next new breakthrough? And if psychiatry isn't working, where do we go from here? When we look over the landscape, one question becomes clear. How can anyone trust psychiatrists with their mental health? Even psychiatrists interviewed at a recent convention of the American Psychiatric Association readily admit they have no answers.
What is the answer to mental illness? That's too broad of a question to answer.
What's the answer to mental illness?
I don't think there are any answers to mental illness.
We still need a better answer than the one we have now for mental illness.
I can't even understand the question.
There's no real answer. You can't. These are like chronic problems. You can't just cure somebody.
Since psychiatry has no answers, how do we care for those with very real and severe psychological problems? There are, in fact, many, many answers, but you will never hear about them from psychiatrists who prescribe psychotropic drugs. One solution was the Soteria Project, formed in 1971 by Dr. Lauren Mosher, then head schizophrenia researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health.
Lauren Mosher developed this program, through NIMH to look at this, because they were starting to have in the research a debate about whether the medications were actually being helpful or whether they were actually causing some problems.
They would create a community-based center where people diagnosed with schizophrenia could go. It was going to be non-drug oriented because he didn't believe that psychiatric drugs were the answer to schizophrenia.
It provided a place to where there could be people there who would be supportive and be there during the time they have a crisis. Instead of medicating them, be there with them and help them through it.
And the results were staggering. Soteria residents did significantly better than their peers who were on drugs, with far fewer readmissions. The success of Soteria House proved that understanding and compassion could relieve mental turmoil far better than psychiatric treatment, and without the nasty side effects. But despite this, Dr. Mosher's breakthrough would soon be utterly rejected by a psychiatric community dependent on psychotropic drugs and pharmaceutical money. In Dr. Mosher's 1998 resignation letter to the American Psychiatric Association, he wrote, "Psychiatry has been almost completely bought out by the drug companies. We condone and promote the widespread use and misuse of toxic chemicals that we know have serious long-term effects. Is psychiatry a hoax as practiced today? Unfortunately, the answer is mostly yes."
When people ask me about why aren't there more places to get this type of treatment and why is biopsychiatry kind of taken over, if they were effective, why did they go away? And I really think that it goes back to the question of money.
Between political pressure exerted by the psychiatric establishment and a lack of funding, refuges like Soteria are few and far between. But they can be found, and the truly troubled can and do recover. But what about common, everyday mental or emotional distresses, such as depression or mood swings? Without using psychiatry, How can we treat those? It's easier than one might think, since there is ample evidence that well over half of all psychiatric problems are actually caused by an underlying, undetected physical condition.
I would say nearly 100% of the time when someone comes in wishing to get off of an antidepressant, I find some underlying issues that weren't addressed originally that may have contributed or else caused their mood disorder.
And you start to look at all the different factors in their life. A lot of times you can find that there's multiple different reasons that someone's not feeling well.
Viruses can cause depression. Digestive issues can cause depression and anxiety.
Iron deficiency is very connected to depression.
One of the effects of pesticide poisoning is depression.
Little children, if they get a streptococcal infection, can become obsessive and compulsive.
I've seen people with bipolar disorder, manic depression, who have food allergies.
Pretty much any kind of psychiatric problem can be associated with a low thyroid state.
A ton of difficulties that a person has that can manifest itself as a supposed mental illness, but you fix the hormone, you fix the gland, you fix the nutrition. Miraculously, you can also fix the quote-unquote mental illness.
Why a psychiatrist cannot get to the root of a person's problem, that's the million-dollar question. I have absolutely no idea. They could. They learn it in school. They could just as easily run a blood test as I could run a blood test. They could run all the diagnostic tests I can. They study anatomy, physiology, pathophysiology. They just choose on their own to treat symptoms.
What about others whose psychological problem is not due to an underlying physical problem?
Divorcing parents, a change in babysitters, moving in the middle of a school year. Those can cause disruptions in the normal flow of sitting in a class and paying attention.
Good things are seen as stressful as bad things. Buying a house can be as stressful as losing a house. Getting married can be as stressful as getting divorced. But it may be some situational anxiety, situational depression that would have resolved on its own years ago. And the patient's been on medicine for years.
Well, it is ridiculous to think that normal depression or grief from normal life circumstances should be treated with medication. We didn't think this way before we had them because people just took it for granted that life was difficult at times. It was stressful, painful, and, difficult emotions, be they anger, pain, sadness, grief. All these things are normal reactions, and to cover that up with medication is really to turn your back on what makes us human beings, which is our emotions.
Of course, serious mental problems do at times require the assistance of others. But because of the massive money power of pharmaceutical companies that keeps paid psychiatrists propped up in positions of influence over the public, the media, and the rest of the medical field, the only treatment you will ever hear of is psychotropic drugs. But there is one thing the consumer can do: insist on full and accurate informed consent.
Informed consent boils down to the patient must be told about their diagnosis and what the risks and benefits and alternatives are to the treatment. Risks and benefits and alternatives to the treatment, risks, benefits, and alternatives to not treatment.
So what are the key points of informed consent when it comes to psychotropic drugs? 1. Psychiatric disorders are not actual diseases requiring medical treatment. 2. There is no scientific proof that psychiatric drugs resolve or cure any mental problems. 3. Psychiatric drugs mask symptoms and come with severe short and long-term side effects. 4. Psychiatric drugs can cause dependency and addiction. 5. Most mental problems are caused by an underlying physical illness. 6. No matter how severe the emotional or psychological distress, there are many effective options that do not involve psychiatric drugs. Unfortunately, these points are rarely told to patients.
I have over 2,000 clients, and I can honestly say 100% of them that have come to me, it has either been suggested that they take psychiatric drugs or they actually have taken them. And probably 70 to 80% have actually fallen into the trap and taken the psychiatric drugs because they didn't know what else to do.
50% of patients who are not treated for depression come out of it on their own without any therapy. Okay, that's never on an informed consent, but it is a fact. So there's never a full informed consent.
But the truth is coming out. 14 U.S. state laws now severely restrict the psychiatric labeling and drugging of children. And a 2004 federal law prohibits school personnel from forcing parents to medicate their sons or daughters with psychotropics. Meanwhile, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has slapped their black box warning label on antidepressants for suicide in children and teenagers, and another warning on stimulants for heart attack, stroke, and sudden death in people of all ages. On another front, psychiatric survivors are now successfully pursuing legal remedies for the crippling effects of psychotropic drugs. Since 2005, there have been 50,000 individual product liability and personal injury lawsuits filed against drug companies for damage caused by psychotropic drugs, an average of 34 suits a day. Eli Lilly, accused of illegally marketing its antipsychotic Zyprexa, has paid out more than $2.5 billion in settlements to 34 states and 31,000 plaintiffs. In 2009, drug maker Pfizer agreed to forfeit over $2.3 billion, in part for colluding with a psychiatric front group to illegally market its antipsychotic, Geodon. Yet with yearly pharmaceutical revenues around $600 billion, drug companies treat judgments and penalties as just a cost of doing business. In fact, billions have been set aside in advance for just that purpose.
The pharmaceutical industry has such a huge financial base that even hundreds of millions of dollars in fines is basically meaningless to them.
Fines for some of these transgressions are like petty cash to the big companies. They're more concerned about the reputation that might be damaged by this. The main thing they do there is just try to hide the fact, and the quickest way to hide the fact is to quickly pay the fine and get out of town.
And this opens the door to enterprising attorneys, but they have to be prepared.
Lawyers need to understand that they do not receive adequate scientific training to conduct these cases by themselves. They need to gather together a team of experts who will help them to do these cases wisely and well. And then other people will begin to see the rates of success that we have had over the last 12 years doing what I call science-intensive litigation.
You have to go to the experts in the field and say, okay, bring your expertise to bear, come to court, and tell people what you know.
I have found that there's an overwhelming number of people that when they see the atrocities that have occurred with psychiatry and the way people have been treated, they are very willing to come over and testify against psychiatry and testify against techniques that are being used.
The court system is just one area where people are speaking out. You too can help by sharing this documentary with coworkers, clients, patients, friends, and loved ones.
These are today's snake oil salesmen. They sincerely believe in the con that they have been taught. So they themselves may be very noble in their intentions, but the people who paid for their education and curriculum are the pharmaceutical companies. These people are the ones who are looking to keep you sick and coming back for more. Many of today's problems can be fixed with dietary changes, exercise, and spiritual well-being. But there is no money in curing people. There is only money in treating people.
Hey guys, thanks for watching.
If you thought this video brought value to your life,
Then like it,
comment,
and subscribe below.
we'd love to hear what you think.